Hello and welcome to episode 76 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are recapping the Call of Duty League's fourth major and a pretty historic result. And I didn't know it was going to be historic, but it turned out to be historic. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Just ready to hop right in. It was a pretty good weekend.
Yeah, it wasn't a great weekend for your sports teams, but it certainly was a good weekend for the CDL. The fourth major, I believe, over 250,000 viewers, at least in the grand finals between the Los Angeles Thieves and OpTic Texas, two of the most popular teams in the league. It couldn't really have worked out better for the CDL, considering all of the circumstances of this major. It was supposed to be in New York, if I remember correctly, and things fell apart there. Ended up happening in Columbus without any fans, but still a lot of fans tuning in around the world. These majors recap that we do, we always kind of try to, we don't cover like match by match because that would kind of be a little boring and it doesn't really fit. But the grand finals, LAT versus OpTic. LAT, they beat OpTic in the winners finals, and then they end up winning 4-2 in the grand finals. Kind of just speaking broadly about LAT, and we can kind of get into specifics here in a little bit. But what did you think of LAT, considering they haven't had kind of the breakout performance that we expected from them maybe earlier on this season?
I think that's the narrative right now around them is that they were finally able to piece something together, right? Like in my head, they didn't have the best Major 2 online qualifiers, but they go on this historic losers bracket run in Boston to get second place at that event. And then last major, I think they did decently in the online qualifiers. I think they might have been the 2 seed. I can't really remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure, it was just like opposite. Like, didn't do great online. Major 2 qualifiers did well at the LAN, and they did better in the online qualifiers for Major 3, but then they got top 8. Last major had that historic hardpoint choke to the Vegas Legion. So, this was finally one time though where they performed well in the online qualifiers, and it translated into a major championship. So congrats to the Thieves. It's a scary thought too for the rest of the league. You gotta imagine that if this is like a common trend of the Thieves heating up towards the end of the season and finally hitting their peak, then that's something that's got to be in the back of the minds of a lot of these teams. Are they, the Thieves won Major 4 last year. There was no Major 5, so they won Major 4 and then champs. Is this a sign of the Thieves potentially doing the same thing again this year? Who knows? But that's definitely a cool narrative in my opinion.
And I think we should mention that the reason I said it was a historic major, historic major and a historic result was Thieves, obviously they won champs last year, and they won Major 4 this year. They are now the first team ever to have won champs and then win an event the following year, which you pointed out in our group chat. It just kind of like it sounds ludicrous, really, because it has been 10 champs, I believe, or I think this might be the 10th champs event. But we've had a decade of these World Championship events, and nobody's really been able to like stick together and get to the next year and win an event. But it makes sense because a lot of those teams don't stick together long term. Like in Call of Duty in general, teams are not the most stable, let's put it frank. Like a lot of these teams break up within months of winning events, or just make one change, which obviously changes everything about like their roster. But for LAT, for them to do it, I believe that was June, or maybe June, July, and then I believe champs was in August, and then to come around 8 to 10 months later and win another event, I think that's really impressive. Were you surprised to hear, just like offhand, like were you surprised that no team has ever been able to do that?
No, I think it is, in context, like you think about, so Black Ops 2, Ghosts, and AW is when Champs was still mid-season or the beginning of
Hmm.
the year. So obviously Farico wins in Black Ops 2. They don't really last long after that because that's when the Cold Dynasty starts. Cold Dynasty without Clayster wins in Ghosts, and then they do win an event later in the year, I believe, with EG. But obviously, that's like the same year. It's the same game as they won their championship on. And then obviously a lot of that Cole team goes to OpTic. At least TP goes to OpTic Nation. Krim goes to main OpTic. Um, so that team breaks up in AW, and then AW Denial wins it mid-season. Half of Denial and Clay and Attach end up on FaZe later in that season, so they win events in AW later on, but obviously different teams. So um, at least in those early years, it makes a little more sense that some teams might have broken up. And then I believe, so that's 2015. 2016 would have been Black Ops 3, which would have been
Envy,
Envy.
which
So
is the
Envy
one that I
stuck to
was.
get,
Yeah, because they got second at champs. I believe
yeah,
they. I,
they
I'm.
got
I
second to
was.
event before Champs too, I
Yeah,
think.
that's the one I was surprised about. I wasn't really
Yeah.
surprised about any of those early ones, but Envy did surprise me because they stuck together.
And then obviously we have 2017 as OpTic. They don't win anything in 2018, which is World War II, which is EG. Then obviously that EG team goes to 5v5, but they don't win anything in Black Ops 4. Um, so Black Ops 4 was E United. Obviously, E United doesn't get into franchising for MW 2019. So yeah, I mean, you go through the list. It might be something that becomes a little more commonplace later, uh, during more years down the road, but it's impressive nonetheless. And who knows? Maybe it is something we don't see too often in terms of the Thieves winning champs and then winning an event the final year. You got to think too. Just even last year during Vanguard, like in those, we were talking about the Thieves heating up late. Like there was a lot of talk about the Thieves needing to make changes and stuff like that after the first couple of events because they just weren't performing well. They bring in Shane as an assistant coach, and they finally switch Kenny to the sub, and it seemed like things clicked for them. Obviously, evident by those two championships in Vanguard, and now it looks like I don't think there's been necessarily any role changes or anything like that for the Thieves this year, but it just seems like now things are starting to click for them, and they were able to put together a run and take home the title.
Another thing that's interesting about the Thieves winning, they are the fourth different team to win a major this year. Major 1 New York, Major 2 Atlanta, Major 3 Toronto, who had like a disastrous like Major 4 stage, and then the Thieves uh, turn it on in Major 4 again. The same thing that happened last year, although it was a different time, different kind of like part into the season because we have another major before we get to champs. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if Major 5 has another different team to win because the it just like a lot of these teams have momentum going into majors, but it's really hard with how tight the skill gap is. Like there's not a huge talent disparity, in my opinion, at least between like the top six teams, the top 5, 6 teams. Whereas in the past, like if you go back to champs 2014 or whatever, 2013, you got like Mind Freak and Tainted Minds and Killer Fish, like these teams that probably don't have like a big chance at beating some of the top teams. Whereas you got 12 of the top teams in the league, or 12 of the top teams in the world. It could be argued that maybe there's one or two challengers teams that are better than the current like lower seeded teams right now in their current form. But in general, I think you have to think that the league is more talented than ever. Call of Duty, the players right now, or the teams at least, because we are so top heavy with these top 12 teams. It's incredible that these teams are still winning events. LAT, like I think it's honestly amazing that a team that had every reason to make a change last year when things weren't going right, that they stuck by each other and they figured it out and then they won 2 events, including the World Championship. And this year, I think they have a very good chance at that again, although I think it's going to be even tougher because Atlanta is, I think like they're right on the cusp like of just figuring it out, but at the same time, I think we've said that quite a bit about FaZe over the past year and a half, right? Because I think, at least in my personal opinion, what I felt is that I got so used to FaZe being the dominant team to be like the team to beat essentially. And they're still number one in the league in terms of standings, so maybe they technically are, but at least in terms of the feeling I have, they're not the team to beat anymore, and that's the Thieves. The Thieves have kind of taken over that, at least in the moment. Maybe that'll change within a few weeks. Maybe LAT will have another bad qualifier run, which is, it happens. They're an LA-based team. It's kind of the luck of the draw, at least in that point. But when it gets to LAN, I don't think the Thieves can be counted out at any point for the rest of the season. What'd you think about OpTic, to kind of shift gears here? Because they did enter Major 4 with an undefeated Major 4 qualifier record, 5-0. They beat LAT, they beat New York. They were looking like the best team. We talked about it on the preview show, talked about how they were probably the team to beat, and that they were likely the favorite heading in, even with no fans, which I think we both agree is not necessarily a disadvantage for OpTic, but it definitely is an advantage when fans are in the building for them. Oh, so what do you think of OpTic? Because they did have a pretty solid run. Just, it's going to be pretty disappointing for the Green Wall, who I saw was having a little bit of a meltdown on Sunday after LAT won.
Yeah, so they beat Boston and they beat New York. The New York win was pretty impressive in my opinion. New York looked strong to start their tournament against Vegas, who Vegas had been looking strong. So that set up high expectations, I think, for the showdown between OpTic and New York, in my opinion. And then OpTic kind of just mopped the floor with them. So I was in my head at that point, I'm thinking this is still OpTic's tournament to win. But then I believe they were on like an 11 hardpoint map streak or something like that, they said on broadcast. And they face off against the Thieves in the winners bracket final, and they lose both hardpoints to the Thieves. So the map one was 250 to 244, so it was very close. But obviously that just wasn't what a lot of people were probably expecting, just based on the strength of OpTic. And I know, like you alluded to, we were both pretty high on OpTic just based on their online qualifier performance. But I think in this series in particular, where am I in the notes? It was on Sunday. That's why. Yeah, Hook had a .76 in the OpTic LA Thieves winners bracket series. Just wasn't up to par with what he was doing earlier in the tournament. If I go and look real quick, I without even seeing the numbers, I know he was frying. Yeah, he had a 1.6 in the 3-0 against the Subliners. He went 77 and 48, led the lobby in kills. The next closest to him was 61 from Dan Ghosty, so just a really strong performance out of Hook. And then in their first series, Hook had a .78, but so I guess I was really thinking about that New York series being the big difference. But Dashy had a 1.5 in the Boston series with 96 kills, so that does make it a little more difficult for somebody else in just a pure statistical standpoint to put up numbers similar to that. So that must have been what I was thinking. It was the 1.6 from Hook in the Subliner series, and then you compare that to the .76 against the Thieves, and that's obviously just not ideal. So not saying it was all Hook's fault, but I feel like if Hook's absolutely frying, like the AW 2015 Hook that we know and love, OpTic is just that much harder to beat, and that's just he just had an off series against the Thieves here in the winners bracket. So yeah, tough one there. But it was good in my opinion to see OpTic immediately bounce back and then just absolutely 3-0 FaZe, because that after losing the first match to the Thieves on Sunday. The wow, I can't talk. FaZe has to play a loser bracket match after that, so they're coming in hot off a 3-2 against New York, but OpTic doesn't let momentum bother them at all. They almost 100-point club them with a 250 to 101. Then they win a search against FaZe, which at that point you got to be thinking it's almost GG there, and then they take the control 3-2. So that was a strong performance out of OpTic to get back to the grand finals against the Thieves, where they did, for the most part, they split the hard points. They split the S&Ds, but the Thieves won both controls. So I feel like at different points this year, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know a lot of people were saying Minnesota prior to, this past major cycle, or the major 3 cycle where they just didn't win anything. But I know a lot of stuff on broadcast was being said about Minnesota, like statistically being one of the better control teams, but I feel like the Thieves, especially if they're that's the difference between them winning and losing the grand finals, potentially going 2-0 in control. Just that could be something to look out for. Let's just take a quick peek here through the Thieves matches. So they win those there. I'd say that is interesting. The only map they lost in the winners final to OpTic was the control. So they won the control against FaZe. And then they lost control against Minnesota. Okay, so not really anything to draw there then, I guess. But I guess just breaking down the maps, though, that could have been the difference in the grand finals. Obviously, if you're splitting the hard points and you're splitting the search and destroy, but you go 2-0 in control.
Yeah, I think LAT is a really hard matchup for anybody, obviously, but specifically OpTic because they kind of mirror each other. Neither team is particularly strong in search and destroy. They're not like, Seattle level bad, back in the, like earlier part of the season, but their strong suit is respawn in both cases. I'm looking at the LAT's map records this season. They are 40-24 on hardpoint, 26-14 in control, and then almost have an equal record, a 500 record in search, 23-22. And pulling up optics, I would imagine that they have almost the identical kind of makeup of their team because they're a really good respawn team. Which is actually surprising that they're actually the worst game mode is control this season, 18-22. So they have a sub 500 record and 27-22. So like an above average search record. And then they're incredible at hardpoint, 41-22, which is slightly better than the Thieves hardpoint record. So yeah, I mean, if the difference is control, then it's kind of like, okay, like I don't know how much you can really work on that because they won a few of those controls. They lost. So yeah, so in the first series in the winners bracket final, OpTic won Expo 3-1, and then they lost that map in the grand final to LAT 3-1. So I guess that could be the difference, right? Is that they lost an extra control that they had previously won, but they on the same note they won a hydroelectric hardpoint in the grand final, and they lost that exact same map in game 1 of the winners bracket final. So I think those two teams are just they're evenly talented, I guess, but I would just give the advantage to LAT because they've been a team for the better part of 2 years now. They have championship experience with Ghosty. Their OpTic has only had him for a few months now. And that pales in comparison to what LAT have been building for a really long time here. So it's just it's one of those things. OpTic definitely look like one of the best teams in the game this weekend and over the past month in the qualifiers. But at the end of the day, LAT have a ton of experience together. They're a really tough matchup for OpTic in terms of game modes, and that's just kind of how it goes. Hopefully for the Green Wall's sake, they'll be able to figure it out when they get to Major 5, and more importantly, when they get to champs, maybe they pull out an extra hard point, maybe they pull out another control, because the search was not that big of an issue. And I would say that the control is probably the biggest issue. Just looking at their full season makeup, maybe that's changed since they've had Ghosty. So Ghosty came in stage 4, right? Before stage 4. But they're like, so since the major 4 qualifiers, OpTic is 13-3 in hardpoint. So they're undefeated on Fortress, undefeated on Hotel. They're 7-4 in search and 7-4 in control. I mean, that's really, really good.
You mean Major 3, right?
Major 3, excuse me, yeah. I'm just looking at the Major 4 qualifiers and Major 4. So was Ghosty in Major 3 and Major 3 qualifiers?
Yeah.
He was. So let's pull everything there. So they're about even in control. They're slightly above average in search and destroy, and then they are overwhelmingly dominant in hardpoint. 27-9 in hardpoint. I just like, we're so deep into the season, and I do think OpTic can improve because they haven't had the most time with Ghosty and this roster. But at the same point, there's only so much time left in the season. I don't know how much you can like overhaul your control or your search and destroy game modes to combat LAT, because they've already kind of dominated FaZe. Like, I don't know what the exact head-to-head record is with OpTic and FaZe, but it feels like OpTic gets the best of them all of the time, whereas LAT feels like they get the best of them.
It was Breaking Point. I put it in the notes because I was pretty mind blown by it. Breaking Point tweeted that OpTic Texas are undefeated against FaZe this season and 8-1 all time. But I feel like that has to only be OpTic Texas. Like, that can't count the Chicago Huntsmen, and it can't count OpTic Chicago, because obviously FaZe was better than the Huntsmen in MW 2019 for the most part. I know both of them won a couple home series, but that was a different format. And then obviously FaZe was the juggernaut in Cold War, so and Cold War would have been OpTic Chicago. So yeah, that is, so I guess OpTic Texas is 8-1 against FaZe and undefeated this year, which was pretty surprising to me. That's according to Breaking Point.
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now, and just off of Gamepedia, FaZe were 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, 4-0, 4-1 against OpTic Chicago. So, I mean, yeah, I think FaZe at their best was better than OpTic when they were OpTic Chicago, but FaZe has not been at their best for 2 seasons now. Like, they are definitely the most consistent team, and that you could just look at the standings and the fact that they've been the top team in the standings for, if they finish number 1 this season, I think every single year of the CDL, they'll have been the number 1 team heading into the playoffs, which is incredible. But they would only have 1 championship to show for it if they don't win this season. Which means that, you know, I think week in and week out, FaZe is a very consistent team, but they struggle against some of these top teams, which is not really an indictment on their roster, because they won a championship. They went to the grand finals of the 2 other championships. So, like, I don't, you know, like, they're 3 for 3 for getting to the grand finals of champs. They're 1 for 3 in winning it. It's not, there's no shame in that, to be honest. Like, they're a really good team, but yeah, they are having a lot of trouble with OpTic at this point, and I'm not sure what they can really do to fix that, because they were struggling with Arcitys last season. Like, I'm assuming that they lost almost every match that they played them last year. Yeah, their only win was Major 4 last year. They won 3-1 against OpTic Texas, and they are 0-3 this season, and I believe that would make them 0-5 last season before that win. So pretty tough road for FaZe, but I mean, OpTic has been a really good team. They were honestly a championship contender until the Illy injury last year, so
Yeah.
It's pretty hard. Any thoughts on what what we've been talking about for the last few minutes?
I think just going to FaZe in general, though, like the sentiment around them, at least in our eyes, this was one of the first times I even picked them to win the whole thing. And um, I know you picked Seattle to win that first matchup against FaZe, especially because Seattle had just beat them pretty convincingly to end the Major Four qualifiers. But
Hmm.
I think FaZe's performance this weekend shows just what they're capable of still. So, like, obviously they lose to the Thieves and OpTic, and those matches weren't necessarily exactly close, but losing to the two grand finalists and getting third again isn't necessarily the worst case scenario, especially considering the teams they had to beat to get there were Seattle, Toronto, and New York. That's two major champions, including the defending major champions,
Yeah.
thrown in there. And I thought FaZe especially looked good against Toronto early on. Toronto kind of fought back to almost force the reverse sweep, but Atlanta clutched up in the game five. And I thought New York looked pretty strong in this event too, outside of the beating from OpTic in the winners bracket. I thought that it's the closest, obviously, placings wise. It's not even close to just how much better this is for New York in comparison to their more recent events since winning Major One. But I think just like form wise, the team looked the best it's looked since Major One in my eyes. Um, so yeah, I think that obviously we always talk about only one team can win, silver linings, yada yada. But I think there are some takeaways for FaZe and New York in this instance, and especially FaZe. It really seems to be like an online thing. Like, sure, they don't play great in hardpoint on land necessarily, but they obviously play well enough on land to get the job done in some cases. If we look here, like they win a hydro against Seattle. That's it seems like they're playing more hydro, so maybe they're trying to mix up their map pool a little bit. But so they went 1-1 in the Seattle series. They went 1-1 in the Toronto series. They went 1-1 in hardpoint. This is hardpoint in the Thieves series. And then it would have been in New York. They went 1-1 in that too, and then they lose to OpTic. So I think that's 4-5, just as off the
Yeah.
top of my head in
Yeah. 4 and
hardpoint.
5.
Yeah. So I mean, that I feel like that's probably better than what they did in the qualifiers, because it felt like they were really struggling in hardpoint in the qualifiers, or at least that seemed to be a recurring theme of that we were talking about week after week. Um, so yeah, I think these are still going to be a contender. Or sorry, FaZe are still going to be a contender throughout the rest of the season. It's just if they're able to put it all together like they did at Major Two, you know how scary this team can be. Um, but now they clearly, I think you said, even if they're number one in the standings, you probably look at Thieves and OpTic as the two top teams in the game right now. So FaZe, for possibly one of the first times, doesn't necessarily have that target on their back, and they can kind of look up and maybe even learn from their losses against those teams, try to adapt, and they have that really strong coaching staff we always talk about. So I still believe in FaZe. And I think that's my main point, is that this was a better performance, despite getting third again. It's a better performance than probably some people were expecting out of them based on their qualifier performance.
Yeah. They were, as far as I can see, their qualifier performance in hardpoint at least. So the major four qualifiers was worse than it was in the major three qualifiers, worse than it was in major three, and it was worse than major four. So those qualifiers were they went 3-6 in hardpoint. They went 4-5 in major four, like you said. They went 3-4, I believe, in major three, and they in major three qualifiers they were 3-5. So like they're pretty consistent in that they are pretty inconsistent in hardpoint. They are a slightly below 500 hardpoint team. They are not a good control team, which is hurting them, of course. And then they're an excellent search and destroy team, almost like very similar to Vegas, except they are not nearly as bad in control as Vegas is, and they're, I think, a little better in hardpoint, but they have like the same makeup as Vegas, which we'll get to them eventually, but it's not a great makeup at the moment, and I just think like they're a really bad fit, or OpTic and LAT, because they are so good in respawns, and they're decent at search. Those teams are very difficult for them to beat FaZe, because like search is their one thing, but if you can't force a game 5 because you can't win a control when you need to, or you can't split the hard points, you don't get to game 5. And I think that's what's hurting FaZe at the moment, is that they're so inconsistent in respawn that they're just not able to beat these teams that they have the advantage. And I think we've talked about it quite a bit throughout the history of the show. Like, S&D win championships, but respawns make up the majority of a series. You gotta be at least proficient in respawns to be good, to be great, to win championships. And when FaZe was winning the championships in 2021, when they were at the top of, they were, I think, the favorite probably heading into the first CDL championship in 2020, if I remember correctly. They were the number 1 seed at least, and they were definitely one of the best teams. At that point, they were winning respawns, and they were not an S&D only team. But it seems like they've kind of become like a specialized team now, where the search part, which the reason they brought in Tupac in what was that, 2021, 22, the reason they even brought him in was because they were struggling. Like, at least in the moment, they were struggling with search, and now it's something that they excel in, but they can't figure it out in the other game modes. And there aren't a ton of hard point and control coaches just floating around the CDL that they can pick up, at least at this point in the season, especially heading into Major 5 qualifiers. I just don't know if FaZe is going to be able to catch back up by the time that it really matters when they get to champs. But I will say one last thing is the fact that they are still the number 1 seed at the moment. Maybe that will change as we get to Major 5, especially if LAT or OpTic win Major 5. That could help them leapfrog FaZe. But FaZe will have that 1 seed. They'll have an advantage. They'll probably play Minnesota. Right now, if the season ended today, they play Minnesota in the winners bracket, or in the winners bracket, round 1 of champs. So I think FaZe has a lot of work to do. I don't know if they're going to really be able to pull it off, but I'm looking forward to it. I think before we get into these other teams, I wanted to get your thoughts on Shane sitting behind OpTic, because some OpTic fans were, I will say, a tad upset that Shane, the LAT's coach, so it was losers bracket finals between OpTic and FaZe, if I'm remembering correctly. I believe it was that series. Shane sat behind the OpTic players because there weren't any fans. They didn't have a main stage or anything. It was very much like a local land type environment with Major 4. Shane sat behind OpTic. He said he watched the one S&D, so the second map of the series, and then he got up and left. But somebody took a screenshot of him sitting behind it and said, like, this is unacceptable, this is just cheating, blah blah blah. I want to get your thoughts on that, because you've been a long time COD fan. You've watched many LANs in your lifetime. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, let's see. So my immediate reaction is that it's just a byproduct of the environment and a result of the the no crowd and the setup of the event in Columbus. You wouldn't see this if the event was at, it was in New York, where it was supposed to be, or in a regular arena with fans and stuff like that, and the teams are on stage. Like, it's probably just an oversight or something they didn't really think about. But the one thing about that screenshot in particular is that there's also Joe Deceives, Fame, and then I can't remember who the other person, but there's other people sitting right behind them too, watching the games too. So are we going to say that, like, it's not possible for, the gorillas in Minnesota to learn anything from sitting behind OpTic too? Or do we only care because, Thieves are playing OpTic in the grand finals, and OpTic is OpTic. I saw some funny tweets from JCap though, and JCap and Octane kind of had the same tweet. Let me go look.
Are you talking about JCaps? Someone once tweeted me asking if I found solace in losing IW champs.
No. Yeah, it was in response, and he said, to the breaking point tweet, Maven tweeted, "This is the dumbest thing I'll see today." And then JCap responded, "Shane hearing OpTic's Mercado S&D strat calls was vital to our success. In parentheses, we haven't played Mercado S&D since Major 2. So I thought that was kind of funny. And I don't know if that's good justification for it. I think, again, it's probably just an oversight. But I don't necessarily think it's the end of the world. Ideally, like I said, these matches are being played in a stadium. Those teams are on stage, and not even their own coaches behind them. So, I think an oversight in terms of the setup, and just probably something that wasn't thought about. But especially if this wasn't even a match in the grand finals and Shane's just sitting back there, like I don't think. I think OpTic fans are just trying to find something to nitpick at there. But what are we gonna do?
Yeah, and even if he was sitting on the opposite side and he wasn't watching OpTic, he could hear everything they were saying because there's no fans. Like it's like an empty building essentially. So like he doesn't. They're like, oh, people are like, oh, he's listening to their strats. It's like they're calling out in hardpoint. Like there are no real strats in hardpoint. It's their breakouts and then like coordinated pushes. But like he's a coach. I'm sure he's been able to watch all of their gameplay for the entire season. It doesn't really matter. Like he's gonna be able to look at this game, look at the mini map, regardless of when or where he does it. He's going to be able to get this information, and I just think it's so stupid. Like it's just people whining essentially. Like OpTic lost, they lost fair and square. Like I don't think any of the players would say anything differently. They lost to LAT is the better, more experienced team. It happens. But yeah, I don't think Shane was hatching a diabolical plan behind them during losers finals. But I did want to bring it up because it did kind of pop off. People really got sensitive about it. And I tweeted that it gives me life because I love reading those comments of these like very angry fans getting really upset about nothing. We see it in real sports all the time about how people get upset over the smallest things, or they want to make like almost like excuses for their own team's shortcomings, when I don't think the players themselves would do that. But I did want to bring that up before we moved on into this major recap. Let's talk about NYSL. You did speak on them a little bit. You said how strong they looked, particularly in the Vegas series. They did end up losing to OpTic 3-0. Then they dropped down the losers bracket and beat Minnesota, and then lost to FaZe. A pretty tough series to go out. They obviously the Major 1 champions, and they haven't been able to get back to that point. But I think this is probably definitely their best performance at a major since then. They had a pretty tough Major 3, if I'm not mistaken. But what'd you think of NYSL and their performance at Major 4?
Yeah, I think I pretty much said everything I wanted to say about New York. My overall thought is this, is their best placing since Major 1, and I felt like their form was probably the best that we've seen since they lifted the trophy at the beginning of the season. So I will mention, though, that the potentially widely being speculated on Twitter, or regarded, I guess is a better word, as one of the best clutches in competitive Call of Duty history was aBeZy's 1v4 in this match against NYSL. It was just kind of absurd. From my perspective, it looked like Priest, I believe, who was the last guy, may have gotten an auto mantle because like he was kind of mantling on top of like the Godheady hotel by that A bomb site. So like you usually wouldn't want to mantle on it and just be standing in the open. I think he was trying to jump and it mantled because he was too close to the box. But nonetheless, it was a really spectacular play out of Abizi. But yeah, I think New York beat the teams you expect them to beat at this event for the most part, and then they lost to teams that you probably expect them to lose to just based off of how they've been playing recently. But this is obviously a side, it's a better sign of potentially good things to come from them heading into the most important time of the season. But if you don't have anything else to talk about with New York, I am ready to talk about the team that I want to talk the most about.
I believe that would be Vegas.
It is.
Yeah, I was gonna bring him up. So let's talk about Vegas. What you give your opening argument or whatever it is in court. Talk about the Vegas Legion.
So if you take out the Vegas performance in the qualifiers, if someone told you that Paris finished last at a major or Vegas finished last at a major, it necessarily wouldn't be that surprising. Maybe Vegas a little more surprising than Paris in the past, but that's semantics. This had to be a different tournament for Vegas, though, in terms of finally being in the winner's bracket, having a chance, an opportunity to separate themselves from Minnesota to try and push themselves up to CDL point standings just a little bit more in hopes of qualifying for champs. They had their own destiny in their hands, and it's not over. We can talk about that more. You sent their schedule though for Major 5 qualifiers. It's going to be tough. But that aside, they were in control of their destiny here at this tournament for arguably one of the first times in the franchise history, and they blew it. This just a really disappointing performance out of this squad, especially based on how well they played in the qualifiers. You could argue, you picked New York to win the first round matchup. I picked Vegas. That was obviously more of a pick with my heart there, but just based on recent performances, it really it could have been a coin flip in my opinion, honestly. But New York is a major champion, and they showed it in that first match. And I believe Temp had like a .43 KD or something like that.
I think it was the lowest KD in
yeah.
CDL history.
That you just don't expect that out of Temp. That's just there's no other way to say it. Like 22 and 51, that's just a really bad series, and it's going to be really hard for a team to win with any team to win with any player playing like that, regardless of who they are. But let alone Vegas is arguably their best player, and the guy they built the squad around. So, that New York series could have gone either way in a lot of people's eyes, and obviously in our eyes, because we had them. We were split on that one. But then that Florida series, like that has to be a must-win game for them. I believe they played in the qualifiers. Vegas won 3-1. I'm pretty sure, because that was like the first time Fellow and Clay played in a while or something like that.
And it was the first time that Vegas had beaten like Florida this season, because they had only played like once this year, and they have been notoriously bad against like the bottom 4 teams as well.
So it was just an absolutely must-win series for Vegas in terms of their hopes for champs, getting points, continuing on in this tournament after that first round loss, and they weren't able to close it out. And it goes to a game 5, which search has been a good mode for Vegas, although it has been a good mode for Florida, especially with Havoc in the lineup. But then they had a 5-2 lead in the game 5, and they just let it slip right through their fingers, and Florida won 4 in a row. I believe it was 5-2, because I believe that's what I typed when we were. Yeah. So that's 4 straight rounds that Florida were able to clutch up and win. Hats off to Florida for, this is, I'm pretty sure, Major 3. It was New York who they beat in the losers bracket first round after starting down there right away, not having a lot of expectations for Florida, most people not having any expectations for them starting in the losers bracket. I'm pretty sure this is 2 consecutive tournaments now where they've won their first match in the losers bracket. But yeah, this really disappointing result for Legion. This is just an opportunity. They had to try to come away with some more points, and especially more points than Minnesota, which they obviously weren't able to do because Minnesota ends up winning 2 matches. I guess we can kind of talk about Minnesota there. The Minnesota versus London match, that's kind of one. Even when we were talking about pick 'em, I really didn't want to pick either team. But like Minnesota had to win that series too. They actually did, unlike Vegas had to win their series against Florida and they weren't able to. But then the Minnesota upset over Seattle is just really impressive, especially the way Seattle's been playing of late. That's a really big win, and that puts Minnesota now in a better spot for that last spot at champs. So Vegas is going to have to have a really good performance in these qualifiers, and it's a pretty tough schedule for them. And then they're going to have to go on a run at Major 5 to try to capitalize and secure a spot at champs. But it's really just that they had their destiny. I know I kind of keep repeating it, but their fate is in their own hands now. Whatever saying you want to say or whatever, they dealt the cards, and now they got to play them out because they had an opportunity here and they really just squandered it.
Yeah. This is, it's been a pretty bleak existence for the Legion and the CDL's history, outside of that one good home series that the Legion had in 2020. They've been downright shameful for most of their existence. They've been really bad. Obviously, we've talked about it at length about last season, the worst season in CDL history. But this was even more disappointing than many of those losses last season because they got our hopes up. They are part of this. They deserve some blame because the expectations have been so low for Legion for years now. And now entering into Major 4, they were tied for 8th place. They were tied with Minnesota with 130 CDL points. They owned the tiebreaker against Minnesota, and they started in the winner's bracket, so they had a buffer. They could lose to New York and still have a chance to walk away with 10 or more CDL points. And they don't do that. They get absolutely dunked on by New York. The opening hard point is decently close as a 50-point game. Then they get 6-0'd in search. They get 3-0'd in control. That's atrocious, to be honest. And I know New York's a good team. I didn't expect them to win. I picked against the Legion for a reason. But then to lose to Florida, like you said, they did what we expected, essentially, is like they won one of the hard points. They won Game 2 search. But we were expecting them to clutch up Game 5 search and win that series and then probably get knocked out the next round because that's just kind of, what Vegas does. Or maybe they might win another round in the loser's bracket. But to walk away with 0 points, and it's just made so much worse because Minnesota actually pulled off some wins. So now we head into the Major 5 qualifiers, and Minnesota has a 20-point lead on Vegas, and we only have this set of qualifiers in the last major left. 20 points doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're Vegas with the schedule that they have, 20 points seems almost impossible, to be honest. I will read you their schedule for the Major 5 qualifiers. First, the Las Vegas Legion play OpTic Texas on the first day of the qualifiers. On the second day, they play the New York Subliners, who just 3-0'd them at Major 4. Week 2, first day of the Week 2, they play Atlanta FaZe, a team that is really, really tough, especially with how they match up against each other. The last day of Week 2, the Legion play the Minnesota Rocker, the team that they were tied with heading into the fourth major. But so I will say
that's a non-negotiable must-win. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Legion are undefeated against Minnesota this year. They're like 3-0, I think, against the Rocker this season. So you would expect them to win that match, but you would also have expected them to beat the Florida Mutineers in a very much must-win scenario for them. And then the final match for the Legion of the Major 5 qualifiers against the Seattle Surge. Again, this is not a impossible game, but I will say that the Seattle Surge are a much, much better team than the Legion are in general. And that's why I tweeted I would be stunned if the Legion won more than 2 games. 2 games, I would be surprised that they win that in the qualifiers, but if they won 3, I would be like on the floor. I would not believe that based on the schedule. They could surprise me. They could surprise us as a league and as a podcast. They might surprise us and win against I don't know which of those teams. Probably FaZe would be like the weakest right now. Maybe New York, but like it's not looking great with how the Legion have been playing. But yeah, it might be over. Like, and it sucks because we talked about it last week. This was the first time that they were in the winners bracket. I talked about how Clayster had kind of like really, I don't want to give him all the credit, but like he's been a part of like these reclamation projects around the league, or in his history, he's had these times where it's not looked great because the players might not fit together on paper, but then they pull out results and they perform way above expectations. And that's happened for the most part this season. Like, I don't think a lot of people were really thinking that the Legion would be in this position of, getting to champs and whatnot. But once you're in that position and you get to 8th place, you get into a tie with Minnesota, you have to perform. You have to get up to the level that people think you should be. And, that it sucks because they're going to get a lot of this is like the first time that we're talking real bad about Vegas this season because it's been a mostly positive experience, at least relative to what we've seen over the past few years. But man, this weekend, especially losing 5-2, or losing that last search and destroy after being up 5-2, that is painful. That's like a horrific loss. And I just don't know if they're going to be able to, get out of it. Like, maybe they'll get an easier draw for Major 5. If they start in the losers bracket, they might play, say, like Florida or I don't know, like maybe a Toronto team that's struggling coming down to the losers bracket. But I just don't see them being able to win 2 more matches than Minnesota, because Minnesota, and we're not even counting that Minnesota could win more matches because they play London this week, or next week in the Major 5 qualifiers. They also play Boston. They play LAT and Toronto, but like they have a much easier schedule on paper than Vegas does. And I think that's just gonna kind of do Vegas in, and that sucks because they might not even get to champs, which is being hosted in their cities. So it's a pretty horrible weekend for the Legion. Any thoughts on Minnesota in general, because they overperformed, but they are now in the driver's seat for the last spot in champs?
I'm gonna look the numbers real quick. I think it must have been the London series between Minnesota and London. Fame had a 1.26 in that series. I thought there was a series where maybe it is the Seattle series.
Yeah, I think he had a good Seattle series.
No, there's a 0.98 in that series. So I don't know what I was thinking of, but this was really just my first time watching Fame, and I thought he played pretty well. Obviously looking back at these numbers, it's nothing, necessarily absolutely wild or anything, but a 1.26 in a 3-0 against London is nothing to scoff at. At least he had 58 kills, which was the most in the series. Bance was right behind him though at 57. Cammy had 56. Cammy had a 1.4. So that is just a good team series out of Minnesota overall. But yeah, I mean, Look, they just like we're talking about with Vegas, Minnesota knew the task at hand for them too. I believe like Minnesota hadn't won a map against LA Thieves at all this year heading into this major. I think that it was like they were 0-4 and it was 3-4 3-0s. Could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure I saw something on like the Thursday before the event of something along those lines. So they were able to respond from that first round loss to the eventual champions with 2 wins. And like I said, that win against Seattle is just absolutely massive, and it gives them sort of that cushion. So like they're in the driver's seat, and they they were in the winners bracket just like Vegas. They lost in the first round just like Vegas, but they were able to rebound and capitalize on their position in the winners bracket to at least come away with some points from this major. Um, Now they're gonna have to try to build off that, and I think the Legion versus Minnesota match will be a big one. But also, it could be one that doesn't mean that much if Minnesota is able to, take away some stuff from this major and, get a couple wins before that. And if Vegas loses a couple matches at the start, that gap could widen a little bit between the two of them. So, who knows? But yeah, I think. For everything, we had Minnesota not necessarily playing great at the end of the qualifiers after they had their little home series where they got the wins. They did an admirable job here to at least walk away with some points.
Yeah. Some teams that we haven't talked about: Toronto, Seattle, and Florida, LAG, London. I mean, the bottom three we don't really need to talk about. I did want to mention that London. This is the fourth major, so that every single major this season, they have not won a match yet. So they are in dead last at the moment with 60 CDL points. They won 2 of their 6 matches in the Stage 1 qualifiers, and then they won 1 match in the Major 2 qualifiers, 2 matches in the Major 3 qualifiers, and then 1 match against the Vegas Legion in the Major 4 qualifiers, which again is pretty haunting for Legion fans out there. LAG, their downward slide just continues. It's pretty sad that the season has gone off the rails so bad. Florida, they did win a match at the major, which very, like what you just said about Minnesota, like an admirable performance. Like this team is not good, but they beat Vegas. They might have ruined the Legion season, and that's what they should be doing. They should be playing spoiler to these teams. And I think technically they are not eliminated yet from champs contention, but all of those teams would essentially need a perfect Major 5 qualifiers and to win Major 5 at this point to catch up to Minnesota. So any thoughts on Toronto and Seattle as teams that we really haven't spoken a lot about, but they both are still in the top 6, and but not strong performances from either at this major.
I think, all things considered, based on Toronto's online play heading into this major, that them getting 2 wins, and almost, they push FaZe to the brink too. It's obviously not ideal for a defending champion, but obviously just based off their 1-4 performance in the online qualifiers, like it could have been worse. So, think they still have some things to work on, but. Yeah, like I said, could have been worse. And Seattle, obviously, just the big upset there too. Minnesota, they still up and down team, but Pred's really been firing in all cylinders, so they go back to work a little bit. They figure things out towards the end of the year here. They're still a really tough team, so I think it's just the product of the tournament atmosphere. There's so much talent in this league and so many good teams that even some of them are going to lose on some days. So yeah, I mean, even looking at the top 4, you got LAT, OpTic, FaZe, and New York. Like that literally leaves out the 2 teams we're just talking about here in Toronto and Seattle, and those are both 2 teams in my eyes that could win a tournament. And obviously Toronto just did win a tournament, so I think it just speaks volumes to the amount of talent in this league and all that good stuff we've talked about numerous times on the pod before.
So the standings at the moment, at number 1, FaZe, number 2, OpTic, LAT in 3rd, Toronto in 4th, NYSL 5th, Seattle 6th, Boston 7th, 8th Minnesota with a 20-point lead over 9th place Las Vegas, and then in 10th you have Florida, 11th LAG, and 12th London. The top 3 teams, Atlanta, OpTic, and LAT, have all qualified for champs. They are like mathematically qualified. I believe Toronto, with another win, would mathematically qualify as well. But the seedings are still very much up for grabs, pretty much at every spot. OpTic in second is only 25 points behind FaZe, and they had 30 more points between the Major 4 qualifiers and Major 4 than FaZe. So it is very possible that OpTic could get the number 1 seed. It's going to be tougher for LAT or Toronto. It's going to be almost impossible for those teams unless FaZe really melts down. I feel like even with a perfect Major 4 qualifier set and Major 5 qualifier set and the Major 5, it would almost be impossible unless FaZe has a meltdown. So the big ones that we'll be watching, and we will preview all of this next week, but Minnesota and Vegas, that's kind of the race to 8th. Like, that's the most interesting part of the last week, and it's pretty much the exact same situation we had last year where NYSL was trying to make their late season push for a champ spot, and I believe we had Minnesota and Florida trying to get in as well, and it ended up going pretty poorly for Florida and Minnesota. I think it was Florida. They missed out on champs on a tiebreaker with NYSL. So we might have that again, which it would probably not end too well for Minnesota if that is the case. But it's going to be a pretty interesting week. I'm very excited. I love the end of the season CDL. It's definitely my favorite time of the Call of Duty year when we have champs kind of on the horizon. Teams are really pushing, trying to figure out anything they can to get some momentum heading into the most important tournament of the year. But before we have champs, we still have a last major, which I'm very excited about, finally getting fans back in as well after a fanless, a pretty soulless existence in Columbus this past weekend. Anything you're looking forward to or you want to discuss? We probably should discuss Nero right before we get out of here.
That's really what I was going to say, tying in with the standings. In 7th place, Boston is at 160. Minnesota's in 8th, right behind him at 150, and Vegas is 130. If Boston slides and Minnesota and Vegas get hot, there's a possibility there Boston might miss out on champs, and especially maybe that has something to do with this, who knows, but just based off recent performances, they're making another change and they're bringing Vivid back in for Nero. So I don't necessarily know how the team is going to work. I would say in general I don't expect a lot of roster changes just because across the league in this week off before the qualifiers start next week, just because I feel like we're almost at the end of the season now, so teams really either know if they're in the running or not. So a change like this, where it's like a player who's already signed to the org and was just on the bench, and they're able to swap him in and out, see what works, then I guess that's not necessarily too surprising. But I am kind of surprised Nero got benched. He was obviously the rookie last year for Boston, and I talked to Denz, the GM of Boston, at Meter 2, and he spoke pretty highly of Nero. So I am a little surprised that he's benched now, but I've also thought Vivid's a really good player, and I was kind of confused about him getting benched to begin with. So I guess it's just got to be a case of Boston trying to find what works and what could potentially lead them to the most success possible.
Yeah, and last season they did something similar when they benched Capsidal for Vivid, and I believe that was before the final major as well. But Boston kind of has at least twice now that they've made these late season roster changes, maybe trying to get kind of a honeymoon period as we head into the final part of the CDL season, and they try to lock up one of the top 8 seeds, which would be pretty shocking to see them slide out of the top 8, but who knows, like crazier things have happened. NYSL happened last year, and that seemed almost impossible for a team that far down to slide back into top 8. So Boston trying to be proactive and hope that it works so they can get another berth to the CDL championship, which would be pretty solid for them, all things considered, to make champs in their first 2 seasons. Our pick'em records before we get out of here. We both went 12-6. A lot of our picks were pretty much the same, except I think the last day we kind of flip-flopped on LAT and OpTic and maybe FaZe and OpTic. I think that might have been the only changes. But, I think a lot of we went with chalk, I think, a lot in those picks. And you got the Vegas picks wrong, or you got both wrong. I got one wrong, which it just not a good omen for Vegas as we head down. I thought we had broken.
You got both Seattle's wrong, though.
Yeah, I mean that's just the Seattle experience at this point. I can't pick them at all, or they will never win. So you are 97-71 on the season, 12-6 at Major 4. I also went 12-6, 92-76. So you have a 5-game advantage heading into the Major 5 qualifiers, which start not this coming week or this week that you're listening to it, but next week. So the first week of May, I believe, will be when Major 5 qualifiers begin, and we'll preview all of that next weekend or next week. When we do our next show. I think we'll probably try to just, because usually our predictions go pretty quickly, I think we'll try to kind of break it up and just give our a little vibe check for each of the teams as we get into this, because we are about to go into the most important part of the season. And some of these teams we will absolutely not talk about once they are eliminated from champs contention. We don't talk about some of these teams as is, but there's absolutely no point to talk about the London Royal Ravens when they're watching champs at home. So we'll give a little bit of a vibe check as we before we do our predictions next week, just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page. Anything else before I close out the show?
Nope, I was just going to say, who knows, maybe I'm completely off and multiple teams do make some last-minute changes here, but I would be very surprised if that's the case. But obviously, if any teams do make any further roster changes over the next week, we will definitely talk about them next time.
For sure. Make sure to subscribe, like, or follow the feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast and a like on our YouTube videos, which we've really appreciated the support on the YouTube channel over the past, the whole season really, but especially over the past month. Some of those videos have done really, really well, and we have absolutely no idea why, but still thank you. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. Next show will be sometime during the first week of May. We're trying to, we've done some Monday shows and then release them on Tuesday. We've done some Tuesday shows and released them on Wednesday. I don't know which people prefer. So if you have a preference, if you like listening to the podcast or watching it on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, please let us know. That just gives us more feedback so we can kind of make the show how you guys prefer it, to be honest. But next show we'll be previewing the Major 5 qualifiers for week 1, the first 10 matches, and we'll, like I said, give a little vibe check for all of these teams heading into the last 20% of the regular season. But that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep, short and sweet. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the Major. Hope you enjoyed our analysis, if that's what you want to call it. Any feedback, like Preston said, please let us know. And yeah, other than that, we'll see you next week. Remember to always send the chow.